full disclosure, we, that would be me and you, are about to navigate what is perhaps the trickiest discussion around these Olympic Games. But don't turn the channel. It's layered, but we can do this. And at the end, there's a slight chance, perhaps, you'll think differently about what at first blush seems to be a black and white issue: sex testing. Okay, deep breath. First, why are we talking about this right now? Well, the Olympic track and field competition started today, and on Wednesday, South African runner Caster Semenya, the front runner for gold in the 800 meters, begins her Olympics. Once this 25-year-old starts burning up the track, and she will, you'll start hearing the conversation around her. But put a pin in gold-seeking Semenya. We'll get back to her. Sports, and Olympic sports, have long been divided into two categories: men's and women's. And whenever categories exist, we charge ourselves with defining, then policing those categories. Why else have different categories, right? So when it came to sports, at first we policed who was and wasn't, quote, female enough by using, to put it coarsely, naked parades, just cursory external examinations. Then, at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, chromosome testing was introduced. This kind of testing was last performed in Atlanta in 1996. This chromosome testing, which was imprecise, was replaced by testing for female hyperandrogenism, or in simpler terms, because that's what I'm trying to do here, women whose bodies produced too much natural testosterone.
There are those who argue that the testosterone level is such a determinant factor that it should play a role in the determination of whether there is an unfair advantage or not in a women's competition.
All right, let's pause for a second, because perhaps your heads are spinning at home. I know mine did when I first started reading about this. A couple things. One, contrary to popular myth, sex testing does not exist to keep out men masquerading as women. This is not Joanna Mann here. Number two, keep in mind we're talking about naturally occurring testosterone, not doping, and I'll add one more. Honestly, truly, there are not just two sexes. All right, back to the lesson. So, that latest policy on sex testing, quote-unquote female hyperandrogenism, a year ago, the highest sports court in the land, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, declared that policy void and gave sports governing bodies 2 years to produce better science to defend the policy's use. This happened because Indian sprinter Duti Chand was flagged for sex testing, then banned from competition until she lowered her body's natural testosterone levels. But instead of complying and changing her body, Chand fought the policy and won. At every step along the way, sports has been befuddled with how to define sex. It's a continuum of unknown length.
What's been happening in sports is that we've been pushed to the limit of science, where we have people saying, no, you have to decide, is this person a male or a female? And once we start doing that, and we start looking at sex, we realize there's all these components within sex.
It's not an unfair advantage. It's the normal, natural advantage that any athlete has. Every true star athlete, whether it's an individual sport or a team sport, has some God-given ability, something that lets them run faster, jump higher, throw a ball with greater velocity, whatever it is. It's not the norm. If it was the norm, they wouldn't be a great athlete, but it's not unfair.
So remember that pin we put in Caster Semenya? Let's go back to it. In addition to because she's ridiculously fast and won silver in the 800 in 2012 in London, sports fans might remember Semenya from the summer of 2009 when she was flagged for sex testing, supposedly for possessing too many, quote-unquote, traditionally masculine features.
The case of Caster Semenya was a grave injustice. This was a young woman of 17 years old who was a superbly gifted young athlete. She won a gold medal for her country at international games. And what she received in return from the IAAF, without any basis, was humiliation, ridicule, and rumor and innuendo that had no basis in fact and no basis in legality.
On the world stage, your sex is called into question. Your life radically changes, and not for the better. So what I would say the most unethical thing that happened here is that the IAAF failed its athletes in not finishing its policy and making its policy well known enough for everybody to know it in advance.
She returned to the track. Semenya's times were good, but not where they were before the sex testing, which led those within track to assume she was taking drugs to lower her natural testosterone to fit within the parameters outlined by the governing bodies. Over the last year, Semenya's times have been untouchable. And at this rate of improvement, she will likely break the 800-meter world record of 153.28 set in 1983. Now, here's how it all ties together. Those within track say the spike in her performance is linked to that court decision last summer. Semenya, they say, now has her natural body back. She's running as her natural self. And that natural self seems to threaten many people. As of today, as of these Olympics, no sex testing policy exists because no test has actually been able to define the midpoint between women and men. Got all that? We can kind of exhale now, just a little bit. Now we're going to start the conversation. We are going to bring in one woman who is very well-versed on this issue. We are now joined by Katrina Karkazis. She's a bioethicist at Stanford University. Katrina, let's start in this place because I know you've done a lot of work in this field. You've been in the middle of this issue. Can you kind of share with us how many athletes, how athletes are flagged for sex testing?
Well, I want to be really clear right now that the policy is not in place. It's been suspended. And so it's a policy right now that policymakers claim is not sex testing or gender verification. They claim that it's a policy about testosterone levels and presumed unfair advantage. And what Cass said, as you said earlier, is that the evidence isn't there to support that. So Cass has been generous in giving them evidence, 2 years rather, to come up with evidence for a policy that was instated 4 years ago or 5 years ago now. So what I've argued is that people believe they can see testosterone on women's bodies, right? They see these surface masculinities that they read as signs of more T. And it's why I've said that these increase scrutiny for all women athletes, because if you don't perform femininity properly, that raises the question of people looking at you about whether or not simply that you're not feminine enough, right? But that it leads to doubting sex and to being investigated for these policies. So it's a policy that affects far more women than those who actually end up being banned under the policy.
We're now also joined by Joanna Harper. She's on the phone with us. She's a medical physicist at Providence Portland Medical Center. She's also a trans athlete. Now, Joanna, I've read a lot of your work on this subject, and I know that through reading that work that you are in favor of having some sort of sex test. Now, I'm not sure what the parameters might be, but can you tell us why you're in favor of making sure that sex testing is in place?
And just like Katrina, I would prefer not to call it sex testing. But I think that athletic federations have the right to limit female competitions to those competitors whose advantage over the others is not so large as to render the competition so unequal that all women can't succeed.
What do you think, Joanna, what do you think the impact to women's sports would be if there were no policy?
If you're saying that no policies regarding intersex women or any person who claims that they're female.
There's no testing for sex in whatsoever at all on the Olympic level. What do you think the impact would be to women's sports?
Well, if you're saying that anyone who claims that they're a female is allowed to compete at the Olympic level of women's sports, then, for instance, I would have been allowed to compete.
Joanna, just
Olympian.
so we make sure we separate it from trans issues and keep it focused on intersex and hyperandrogenism and testosterone and how we're policing women's sports in that vein, because I think once we cross into those lines, the conversation does get a little bit muddled. If there were no intersex policy, hyperandrogenism policy, which was the most recent one, what do you think that would be the impact to women's sports?
Well, I think that you would see certainly some events where there were virtually, virtually all of the medalists at the Olympics would be intersex.
Katrina, let's go back to you, because from reading your work, I've read in numerous places, including the New York Times, that you are in favor of eliminating testing, sex testing. And if I'm using the incorrect terminology, please tell me there, but I've read that you are in favor of eliminating it, that we don't need it. Can you share why you feel that way?
Yeah, so I want to go back to something. What Cass was very clear on, this is undisputed, and you can read it in their 160-page decision, is that this policy discriminates against women. So the Olympic Charter has an athlete bill of rights that works in very much the way that nations around the world have bills of rights to protect minorities. And Cass's decision calls on that Bill of Rights to say that you can't discriminate against a minority, as has been done with this particular policy. They call it discriminatory against women. And what they've said is you can't discriminate because the scientific evidence regarding a large performance gap between women with hyperandrogenism and women with lower levels has not been proven. And so without that evidence, there's no policy to be spoken of. So that's a problem. I also take issue with really the kind of gross speculation that is happening in the media right now about quote unquote all intersex podiums, especially from someone who is affiliated with the IAAF. That actually, to me, starts to create a kind of a witch hunt and heightened scrutiny of other women. So for me, and you know, this is what I would say to the sentinels of the gender apocalypse that tell us that women's sport will no longer be women's sport. It's going to be the same as it's always been and as it is right now. Women who have lived and competed as women their whole lives competing against women. Nothing is different.
Katrina, so my understanding of who is flagged for sex testing is not the same as doping in that it's just totally random. It's not the case for sex testing from everything I've read. So how does the IAAF and the IOC, when they've had these policies in place, ensure against profiling?
They don't. And so what we know is that actually Dutee Chand, who you mentioned, and Caster Semenya were both tagged through profiling, meaning people complained about their appearance or actually how they ran, arguing that it was too male-like, and that triggered the investigation. And so there's a way in which calling out athletes as masculine or performing in masculine ways can actually lead to an investigation. But the other route that had led to investigations was through doping screens. And I want to be really clear about something in terms of gender equity. What we do with men when they're flagged for a doping screen, when they have high testosterone levels, is that it goes to a carbon isotope test. It's undisputed that that distinguishes between endogenous, meaning natural testosterone, and exogenous testosterone, which is doping. And if it comes back and shown that it's natural for that particular ratio that came back, the case is closed. For women, that's just the beginning of a whole level of tests and examinations that certain athletes have gone through. And we need to think about what that's for. Because someone has already established that that testosterone level is natural, so that's undisputed. Those exams are no different than the ones that have been in place for decades under the so-called sex testing policies. So it's why sometimes I switch back and forth, because what actually happens in practice is no different than what's happened for decades. And interestingly enough,
Katrina, I'm
people
cut you off 'cause
affiliated...
I want to be able to get Joanna in one last question here. Joanna,
Sure.
I know that you have written eloquently about there's all these categories to defend here. Do you defend women who might be intersex? Do you defend the majority of female athletes here? Why have you landed in a place where you feel like there's any defending necessary?
Well, there, anytime one takes a position where, where there are high emotions, you're going to have to defend your position. And, Katrina has to defend her position. I have to defend my position. So, of course, and quite frankly, I also need to defend my position from people on the other side who think that intersex women should not be allowed into women's sports, period. I have been called a destroyer of women's sports for taking what I call a middle ground between Katrina's position and between those people who say that intersex women should not ever be allowed into sports. So I have to defend from two sides.
All right, Joanna, thank you so much for joining us, and Katrina as well. You can continue the conversation with us on OTL Extra. Once Caster Semenya hits the track, I'm sure we'll hear much more about her. And also, you can check out our social page. Follow me at KateFagan3 or follow OTL at OTL on ESPN. Watch us on ESPN.com/OTL, or you can listen to us on Sirius XM Channel 81.